Okay, so this isn't strictly my story, but the whole thing involves my grandpa and my great aunt, a sister. But since they're no longer with us anymore, it's one of the most horrifying true stories I've ever heard. And I figured I'm within my rights to tell it. My grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in a really poor town out in Oklahoma. I mean, the way my mom tells it, they really didn't have a pot to pee in. They used to eat stuff like dandelion salad, literally just eating boiled eggs with wild dandelions. They were that broke. Even worse for my grandpa and great aunt, who were like 12 and 8 years old, respectively at the time. There's absolutely nothing to keep them entertained. They made a good go of it, turning pieces of junk into toys. Like never see that old-timey thing of a kid wiping a bike tire along with a stick? Yeah, that kind of thing. Their childhoods were just not like ours. They were accustomed to extreme boredom, grinding poverty, and back-breaking labor. So you can guess how excited they got when they heard the carnival was coming to town. There'd be games, rides, candy, sideshows, absolutely everything a kid that age could ever want. The only thing was, their family didn't have the money for them all to go. Just enough for 2 entry tickets with a little left over for cotton candy. So being the good folks they were, my great-grandparents decided they'd give the kids the money while they stayed home. Must have been like all their Christmases had come at once. The only condition was that my 12-year-old grandpa was not allowed to let my 8-year-old great aunt out of his sight. Then on the evening in question, Grandpa and Great Honor given like 50 cents between them and told me back by sundown. Then they ran off down the pasture where the carnival had been given permission to set up the way my dad tells it for the first hour. So Grandpa and Great Aunt had the time of their lives. I think tickets were like 5 cents or something. Then cotton candy was 2 cents apiece. Basically, the parents had underestimated how expensive stuff would be, so they were able to partake in everything the carnival had to offer twice. Maybe that's what led them to a false sense of security, because it certainly accounts for them staying long after the sun started to set. Only when my grandpa realized how late it was, and he started looking around for my great aunt. She was nowhere to be seen. I want to remember asking my dad why they just thought it was okay to let their kids go running around in their own like that. If it's just like an old-timey thing, or because they were so poor. Dad said it was more like because all the people going to the carnival were their neighbors. They didn't figure there was any risk. But then there's my grandpa, totally unable to find his sister, and he's starting to get worried. He started asking all the people he recognized from our town if they'd seen his sister, but they all said no. Right up until one of our neighbors said they saw my great aunt walking hand in hand with the grown-up. I think they figured it was my great-grandpa or something. But when my grandpa explains that his dad isn't even there, this guy launches into action to try and help find my great heart. So Grandpa and this random neighbor guy apparently ran away with the actual carnival and towards where the workers had set up their trailers and whatnot. That's when they heard a girl crying from inside of them. The neighbor tries to open the door, but it won't budge. So he starts banging on it. Some evil son of a gun opens the door and tries to explain it away by saying my great aunt got lost or something, that she's just inconsolable, crying in a way that Grandpa had never seen before. Scared, but sad at the same time. This neighbor then rushes my grandpa and great aunt home and tells their parents all about what had happened. My grandpa knows something bad happened to my sister, but it just doesn't know what, because she won't talk about it. Obviously, my great-grandpa was absolutely furious, so he grabs a shotgun, rounds up a few buddies, and they went down to the carnival to basically do God knows what to the sky. Again, this is all from my dad. But according to him, this huge fight starts at the carnival. People on all sides almost get shot. Then they all freeze after the carnival chief fires a gun into the air. He then agrees to parlay with my great-grandpa. That after talking for like 10 minutes in some weird-looking corny trailer. As great-grandpa walks away from the carnival empty-handed. Everyone thought he was crazy. Some monster had just put his hands on his only daughter, and after a short powwow with the man in charge, he was happy to just walk away. His buddies confront him on it, obviously wanting to know what the deal was. My great-grandpa apparently tells him to put a sock in it, because it's all been ironed now. That night, my great-grandpa apparently puts on his boots and headed down to the carnival one more time before it left town. It meets up with this carny chief, who asks if my great-grandpa still wants satisfaction, which he obviously did. The carny chief beckons to two workers who carry out like a basket or something before laying it in front of my great-grandpa, and they invited him to open the lid. He complied, and when the smell hit him, I doubt he had it in him not to pew, because according to my dad, the carnies had stacked the offending worker's separate head on a pile of his own guts, and his own junk had been stuffed into his mouth. The carny chief then told him, while pointing at his junk, "First we cut off this, then we cut out those, then point to the guy's guts. Only when he stopped moving do we cut off that, then points to his head." Apparently after that, the carny chief once again asked my great-grandpa, "Are you satisfied?" He just nodded, turned, and then walked away. The carnival was gone the next day. I think he told my great-aunt what happened to that guy too, because she never seemed to turn off about it. No, something really bad must have happened. They killed the guy, but she actually went back to the carnival the next time it came around and borrowed a face from my son, I guess. They were built different back then and just dealt with trauma differently or whatever. Or maybe it's much easier to get over this sort of thing when you know the guy who did it suffered on Earth before he died. I suppose that's what freaks me out so much about my grandpa's story. That almost sounds like it came from a different country or something. All that poverty and vigilante justice. I just don't recognize that same kind of thing in America today. Not in such an extreme way anyways. And that sure had me counting my blessings, let me tell you.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
I come from a remote island called Rendova, located in the Solomon Islands, and have since moved overseas, hence access to the internet. Across from our island is another island called Tetepare. The story of Tetepare is really interesting, because it was abandoned completely by the inhabitants a few centuries ago. Just like the villagers fled the island to come to neighboring islands, such as my own, and here we are a few centuries later. Because of the lack of humans on the island, it is known for its biodiversity, and few researchers come every now and again to have a look. If you're looking for cool remote places to travel after the pandemic, I highly recommend it. The interesting part of Tetepare for me was, why did everyone just leave? If you were a villager back in the day, it would have been a great place to live. Volcanic soil to grow crops, an abundance of fresh water, animals that were easy to hunt. But the official story told is there was a great sick, and people were dropping like flies left and right. So the villagers fled to get away from the sick. However, the island is known for being so very big. Realistically, if you wanted to get away from others, it wouldn't have been too hard. because you could be self-sufficient on other parts of the island. The story told to me growing up is a bit different though. Back in those days, we loved to fight. A war canoe from my island Rendova arrived on Tetepare to fight. However, upon arrival, they were met with numerous unburied dead bodies. All the large canoes that belonged to the Tetepare people were gone. To leave so hastily and not even bury your dead was a really weird thing, because it was back in the days where they first thought that spirits had done this to these people. However, the people from Rendova decided to set up villages against their better judgment. In due time, they also fled because the spirits that had decimated the population of Tetepare apparently attacked the newly set up villages there. Ever since, the island has continued to remain uninhabited, except for a few of the eco-lodges that tourists come and visit now and again. Now in present day, we go to Tetepare to maybe have a picnic or go hunting. We are, however, extremely cautious, because it is believed the island is still extremely wild, and because of the lack of humans, spirits run amok on the island. I have some weird stories about going hunting there too, and I think it's time to tell you them. The island is said to be wild because no churches have been built on it yet. For this reason, it is alleged that spirits still roam free. Ever since I was small, we went hunting on Tetepare. They have an issue with wild boars destroying their natural habitat, so hunting is encouraged, and as a result of chasing boars around the island, I have a pretty good knowledge of knowing where things are. A few years ago when I was younger, while we were hunting, we decided to go visit our other relatives at the Eco Lodge. Recommend visiting if you want a unique experience. There was a researcher who wanted to have a look at unique flora and fauna, and since I was the only one who spoke English somewhat fluently, I volunteered to take him. We explored the island quite extensively. The thing is, we know that when we're hunting we don't go deep into the rainforest, because you may not come out. Simply because of its density, but also because there have been stories of other things. Anyway, I was taking this researcher around and he had a navigational piece of equipment. He was using it to see where we were going. The day was coming to an end, and I wanted to return to the Eco Lodge because I didn't want to be camping in the middle of the night without shelter. The way we normally do things is come back out of the rainforest towards the coast, and from there, walk to wherever we need to go, because we don't want to get lost in the rainforest. I knew where we were, and I knew the way to the coast, and told the researcher, let's get going this way. This is where things get weird. His device was saying the coast was the completely different direction from where I knew the direction to the coast was. Now I've heard stories when people go hunting about losing their minds and going straight into the rainforest and never coming back out. At that point I had to question my own brain, because what his device was saying was completely different to what I knew. But I knew in that moment that it may be his device playing up, and I didn't want to take the risk of disappearing into the rainforest because of it. I had walked this forest thousands of times, so decided to trust my gut. I told the researcher I thought his device was incorrect. He did not like the sound of that at all and tried to argue with me, saying that I was wrong. I knew something was wrong, and so I didn't want to spend my time arguing and wanted to get out of their area ASAP. So I basically told him, I'm going the way I know to get to the coast. You can follow your device if you want, but I'm not following you because you're wrong. We may die. Long story short, I followed the direction I knew and lo and behold we made it to the coast. Thing is, if we'd have followed his device, we would have ended up in the densest part of the island where people are known to have gone missing. When we made it back to the Eco Lodge, he apologized and checked his device to see if it was broken. But lo and behold, turns out it was working perfectly again.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all this support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
Oh boy, does it give me shivers to this day. For a little background, my grandma lives in a house that she inherited from her aunt, my great-aunt, after she died, and it's a beautiful secluded area along the Irish coast that is half an hour away from a city and within a lush green ivy forest by the sea. Proper Celtic fairy tale stuff, right? Oh, except she lives around some absolute nut jobs as well. One of them was a dysfunctional family that lives in a stone cottage across from our house. I only loosely know about what happened and why they were living there, but basically the dad was abusive. And before I was born, the eldest son got sent to prison for repeatedly raping the daughter. She took him to court with DNA evidence, but that's a different scandal. The youngest son, who I'll call CN for creepy neighbour, never went to school and is supposedly mentally impaired. Before I continue with this story, I want to clarify that CN was also probably abused growing up, and although it is very unlikely, I hope he gets the help and care that he needs one day, because from what I have heard, he is a danger to himself and others. Now, on with the story. It began on a summer's day, when my twin sister and I were about 6 years old, and we were staying at our grandma's house for the summer and playing on her lawn near the gateposts into her driveway, while she and our parents were inside preparing lunch. CN, who was still a young man, and would always hang around and enter neighbours' gardens without permission to say hello, was the mental age of a 7-year-old, and he just didn't understand boundaries and was creeping people out. He saw us both playing and came into the garden to talk to us. I can't remember if we learned about stranger danger at that point, but we assumed that he was one of my grandma's friends and both talked to him just to be polite. My concentration as a child was terrible, and CN slurred his words as he rambled on. Like I mentioned, he was illiterate, and asked us questions such as if we liked the new t-shirt he was wearing. But then he started talking about his willy. I zoned out of the conversation up until this point. Hearing that word suddenly made my gut alert, because not long before my mum explained to me about how boys and girls have different sex organs in a way that I could understand, and how it was important that they were kept private. My sister and I stood silently as CN continued talking to us about his equipment. I am not sure how my sister was feeling or if she knew how to react, but I felt myself growing more and more uncomfortable the longer he stayed and talked, and was beginning to wonder if I should go into the house to get my grandma. Then CN asked, "Do you want to see my willy?" My cheeks and stomach were burning with shame at this point, while my sister squeaked, "Yeah," probably not knowing how to react either. My head was screaming, "What on earth are you doing? Why did you say yes?" Then I heard CN unzip, and I clenched my eyes shut and looked away while my ears listened for when he'd zipped himself back up again. I don't remember much after that, except a few minutes later, my grandma came out to the lawn, Mum and Dad in tow, and she calmly told my sister and I to go inside. Apparently Grandma then proceeded to ask CN what he was talking about to us, and he told her that he was talking about lorries. But eventually she got the truth out of him. Later that day she called the police, and when an officer arrived he took a statement from my twin sister and scribbled down her account of what had happened. That night my dad went to the stone cottage accompanied by police and a family friend, who I will call good neighbour, GN. CN was scared of GN, because GN once punched him for coming up to his farm at night and frightening his daughters. So with backup, my dad knocked on the door, asked for CN and threatened to kill him if he ever came into my grandma's garden again. For the record, my dad is a pacifist that doesn't tolerate violence or confrontation, but this incident understandably made him very angry and upset. When I was at my grandma's house after that, the adults always kept a close eye on us from then on. They wouldn't let us go out alone, and understandably would get very mad if we disappeared. When we were old enough to be allowed to go out for walks alone, we were told to run back to Grandma's house if we ever saw CN and tell him. We're telling our dad if he tried talking to us. Thankfully my parents would always usher us away if they did see him, or tell him to keep away. My grandma still gives him a Christmas card every year, but this incident really upset her, and she stopped allowing him into her garden after it happened. It must have been difficult for my parents to keep us both calm and help us understand that it wasn't our fault, but CN for being a very rude man. Nonetheless, avoiding CN in the neighborhood always added a sense of adventure to the summer holidays. But as I grew up to understand what was going on and what happened to that family, it was a bit of a shock, and I still get unsettled thinking about it now. I'm so thankful that my gut told me to look away that day, because if I did see anything, then I probably would have been much more scarred for life than I am now.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all this support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
When my Nana was very young, she was fortunate enough to have been able to meet her great-grandmother. The women in our typically Irish family tend to have their children at a young age, so it's not unusual for one of the older members of our clan to be able to meet their great-grandchildren before they shuffle off their mortal coil. Now, her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, always wore black. She was a scathing but witty old dear, and if she didn't like you, she would say things like, "May the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat." She was also a widow, lost her husband early on in their marriage, and stuck to her vow of perpetual mourning. The experience made her a deeply religious woman, too. I mean, every Irish person has a little of the church in them anyway, but she took her faith very, very seriously after losing her husband, and I think a lot of that is down to the circumstances in which she lost him. You see, my great-great-grandfather was a sailor in the Royal Navy, which wasn't unheard of back then since we were still subjects of the British Empire, and the ship he sailed on was named the HMS Wasp. Early one morning in the year of 1884, the crew of the HMS Wasp were given the task of ferrying a gang of bailiffs and police to this place called Inistrahall, a little island off the coast of Donegal. The police had nasty business to attend to, as on the island, 3 poor families were no longer able to pay rent to the landowner and were due to be kicked out of their houses. When the sailors found out that they were abetting such cruelty, their hearts sank. The HMS Wasp has visited them previously, delivering a few sacks of potatoes when the islands were on the verge of starvation. They knew how hard life was for the poor islanders, who somehow eked out an existence on a rock that's less than half a square mile in size. The way my Nana tells it, it was so early in the morning that the sun hadn't yet risen, but the crew of the Wasp had sailed those waters many times before, and the veil of darkness was no hindrance to them. Yet somehow, the ship managed to collide with some rocks just off of a place called Tory Island. The ship went down fast, with only 6 of the boat's passengers and crew surviving the freezing cold waters. 52 sailors, policemen, and bailiffs drowned that morning, with my great-great-grandfather being one of them. The incident was a huge scandal, and mainly because it emerged that the HMS Wasp had sunk directly within sight of a lighthouse. This meant that, by all accounts, they should have been well aware of their positioning in relation to rocks they knew well were there. So, as you can imagine, a great deal of rumor and mystery shrouded the ship's sinking, and one particular explanation seemed to capture the imaginations of the mainlanders. It was said that the folk who lived on Inistrahall Island had long been isolated from the Irish mainland and viewed mainlanders with contempt and suspicion. Hundreds of years before, Christianity had been slow to make its way over to Inistrahall, and legend speaks of a massacre that occurred there after many of the islanders refused to renounce their old gods. People said that there was still some who lived on the island that worshipped pagan deities, invoking ancient curses and performing blood sacrifices. So, when a ghastly theory emerged that the islanders had used a kind of cursing stone known as a cloc terre to sink the Wasp before it could land bailiffs on the island, people actually believed it. What's worse is that the story then tells of a local priest who heard of such ungodly practices and sailed to Inistrahall. There he located the cloc terre and promptly hurled it into the ocean to cleanse the taint of paganism from the island. The same priest then safely made it back to the mainland where, by some horrible twist of fate, slipped and fell on a walkway one day and drowned in the River Finn. People were absolutely convinced it was the curse of the clock Teray, and my great-great-grandmother was one of them. Until the day she died, she believed something unholy had risen up from the ocean to take her husband away from her. Now obviously, I know that's just a silly old story my family tells, despite all my aunties swearing it's the God-honest truth. And I know because I actually did some research into the sinking of the HMS Wasp, but that didn't make what I found any less horrifying. The Royal Navy held an inquiry into the incident and were looking to court-martial the surviving sailors for negligence. Only one of the survivors had been on deck at the time of collision, and this man swore that the lights of the Tory lighthouse went dark not long before they hit the rocks. Since it was a routine journey for the crew, a junior officer was placed at the helm to gain some experience, but was so lacking in that department that he was unable to navigate in the dark, hence the ship hitting those rocks. To me, the idea of the lighthouse going dark is much more feasible than any cursing stone or what have you. But that means that the people of Tory Island colluded with the people of Inistrahal to plunge the ship carrying their tormentors into darkness. The islanders killed 52 men that morning, all to avoid being evicted from their homes. Whether or not you can blame them is another question entirely, and given that I actually lost a relative in the incident, I don't think I can give you an unbiased answer. But the fact remains that 52 people found themselves plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean on a freezing winter's morning in complete darkness. Imagine the horror of slowly hearing the cries of your shipmates gradually falling silent until you yourself are taken by hypothermia. You certainly don't need a belief in the supernatural for that tale to give you the shivers.